My mother-in-law smiled at me through the glass door of the ICU waiting room, and I remember thinking that something about it was wrong. Not the smile itself. She had always been polished, the kind of woman who knew exactly how to arrange her face for every occasion. What was wrong was the timing. My husband had just been told I might not make it through the night, and she was smiling. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Before we dive in, drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from. I genuinely love knowing where people are tuning in from across Canada and beyond. And if you're new here, please subscribe. There are more stories like this one coming, and trust me, you don't want to miss them. It was a Thursday in late November when everything fell apart. That particular kind of Canadian November where the sky goes flat and gray before 8 in the morning and never really changes. I was 31 years old, 7 months pregnant, and driving home from my OB appointment in Mississauga. The 401 was moving well for once. I remember thinking that was a good sign. I never made it home. The transport truck came out of the left lane without signaling. I saw it happen in what felt like slow motion. The massive rear end swinging wide, the gap between us disappearing, and then there was nothing but the sound of impact and the feeling of the world turning sideways. When I came back to myself, I was hanging from my seatbelt, the car folded around me, and somewhere far away, someone was screaming. It wasn't me. I couldn't make a sound. I woke up in Sunnybrook 3 days later. My husband Callum was sitting beside the bed when I opened my eyes. He looked exhausted in a way I had never seen before, unshaved, his shirt wrinkled, his hands folded tight in his lap. When he saw me blink, he stood up so fast the chair scraped the floor, and for a moment, I thought he was going to say something important. Instead, he called for the nurse. The doctors explained everything carefully and professionally. A ruptured spleen, 2 fractured ribs, a collapsed lung that had been reinflated during emergency surgery, and our daughter. They had delivered her at 32 weeks while I was unconscious on the operating table. She was small, they said. She was fighting. She was in the NICU down the hall, and I could not see her yet because I could barely turn my head without the pain making everything go white. Her name was going to be Faye. We had agreed on that months earlier, lying in bed one Sunday morning with the window open and the smell of rain coming through. Faye. I repeated it to myself in that hospital room while Callum stood near the window answering texts on his phone, and I held on to the name like it was the only solid thing I had. My mother came that first afternoon. She held my hand and cried quietly, and didn't try to fill the silence with words, which I was grateful for. Before she left, I asked her the question that had been sitting in my chest since I woke up. Could she take Faye? Once my daughter was discharged from the NICU, which the doctors said could be weeks away, could my mother bring her home and care for her, until I was well enough to be transferred out of the ICU, until I could hold my own child without monitors beeping on both sides of the bed? My mother was quiet for longer than I expected. She looked down at our joined hands. She said she was already helping my brother with his kids 3 days a week. She said her apartment wasn't set up for a newborn. She said she was 64, and her back had been bad since the summer. She said all of this very gently, in the tone of someone who has prepared an answer in advance, and when she finished speaking, she gave my hand a soft squeeze as though that settled it. I stared at the ceiling after she left and felt something shift inside me that I don't have a word for. Not quite grief. Not quite anger. Something that sits between them, cold and very still. Teller Paulette came the next morning with a tin of shortbread and a get-well card signed by his entire extended family. She set both on the bedside table, adjusted the flowers someone had already brought, and then sat across from me in the vinyl chair, and folded her hands in her lap and looked at me in that particular way she had. Like she was assessing damages. I asked her the same question I had asked my mother. She didn't look at the floor. She looked straight at me, which I had always found unsettling about her, that direct gaze that gave away nothing. She said that she and Callum's father were planning to spend December in Palm Springs as they did every year. She said the flight was already booked and the rental was already paid. She said a premature baby was a great deal of responsibility, and she wasn't sure she was the right person. She said these things one after another, with the shortbread tin sitting between us, and then she stood up, straightened her coat, and told me to focus on getting better. She was gone before the lunch tray arrived. I lay there in the silence of that hospital room, the hiss of the ventilation, the distant intercom, the small sounds of a building that never fully sleeps, and I tried to understand how I had ended up here, 31 years old. A daughter fighting to breathe in a room down the hall, a husband who seemed to be somewhere else even when he was physically present, a mother who had said no, a mother-in-law who was going to Palm Springs. 3 weeks into my hospital stay, something changed. A traffic investigator came to see me on a Tuesday. She was professional and matter-of-fact, which I appreciated. I had no patience left for softness by then. She told me that the collision reconstruction team had completed their analysis of the accident. The transport truck's dashcam footage had been reviewed. The initial assumption had been that the driver failed to check his mirror before changing lanes. But there was a complication. A second vehicle, a dark SUV, had been observed on traffic camera footage approximately 40 seconds before the collision, in the same stretch of highway. The SUV had moved in a pattern that appeared, according to the investigator's careful phrasing, inconsistent with normal traffic flow. It had moved alongside the transport truck, in a way that, according to the reconstruction team, may have contributed to the sequence of events that pushed the truck into my lane. The SUV had not stopped. It had not been reported at the scene. Its plates had been partially obscured. The investigator was not saying it was deliberate. She was saying the investigation was ongoing. She was saying I should be aware. After she left, I spent a long time looking at the window. Snow was falling outside, the soft early December kind that settles on everything and makes the world look gentle and temporary. I thought about the weeks before the accident. I had been going through Callum's home office files. Not snooping, or not exactly. We had been trying to refinance the mortgage on our house in Oakville, and I needed to locate some income documentation. I had found the files I was looking for, but I had also found other things, statements from an account I didn't recognize, transfers to a numbered company I had never heard of, amounts that didn't match anything I knew about Callum's consulting practice. I had asked him about it the week before the accident. He told me I had misread the documents. He told me the numbered company was a holding structure his accountant had set up for tax purposes. He was patient and calm in the way he always was when he thought I was being irrational, which made me feel like I was going in circles, because I had read those documents very carefully, and I was not someone who misread financial statements. I had worked in corporate accounting for 6 years before I took parental leave. I knew what I was looking at. I just didn't know what to do with what I was looking at. Now, lying in a hospital bed with 2 fractured ribs and a daughter in the NICU, I turned it over again in my mind. The account, the transfers, the dark SUV that didn't stop. And I thought about the timing, that I had asked Callum about those documents exactly 8 days before I ended up on the 401 with a transport truck coming into my lane. I told myself I was being paranoid. I told myself trauma does things to the mind. But I couldn't fully make myself believe it. It was during the 4th week that my grandmother came. She had driven up from her house in Stratford, a 3-hour drive, without telling anyone she was coming. She was 78 years old, and she had never stopped driving, which had been a point of ongoing family debate for at least 5 years. She arrived at Sunnybrook on a Wednesday afternoon, wearing her winter coat, and carrying a bag that turned out to contain, among other things, a container of her butter tarts, a paperback novel she thought I would like, and a manila folder stuffed with papers she would explain later. When she came through the door, I burst into tears in a way I hadn't managed to do since I woke up in that hospital bed. She sat beside me for a long time without saying anything particular. She patted my arm. She told me Faye was beautiful. She had already stopped at the NICU on her way in and introduced herself to the nursing staff, with a confidence that I imagined had left them somewhat charmed and slightly bewildered. She said my daughter had my nose, which made me laugh for the first time in weeks, which hurt my ribs considerably. When I stopped laughing and we had both settled, she looked at me with the expression I had known my whole life. Not soft exactly, but steady. The face of someone who has seen enough difficulty to know that most things can be survived, and who isn't going to pretend otherwise. She said, "There are things I should have told you a long time ago." I looked at her. She opened the manila folder. My grandmother, my mother's mother, Edith, although no one had called her that in 30 years, everyone called her Gran, had been paying attention to Callum for longer than I realized. Not obsessively, she was quick to clarify. But she was a woman who had run the books for her husband's small manufacturing business in Perth County for 40 years, and she had a particular radar for financial arrangements that didn't add up. She had noticed things at family gatherings. Comments Callum made about investment opportunities. His ease with certain kinds of vague language around money. The way he spoke about his consulting work without ever quite being specific about who the clients were. She had looked into the numbered company, not deeply. She didn't have the resources for that, but enough to find that it had been incorporated 3 years ago, Around the same time, Callum's parents had transferred a significant piece of real estate to a family trust. She had gone to my mother with her concerns, she said, roughly a year before the accident. My mother had told her she was overreacting. I sat with that for a moment. Gran also told me something else. She had been speaking, carefully, with an old friend of hers, a retired RCMP officer who now worked in private financial investigation. He had made some informal inquiries, and he had found that the numbered company appeared to be connected to a broader network of transactions, some of which bore the name of Callum's father as a signatory. Not just Callum, his father too, and the real estate transfer, and the family trust. And the fact that my grandmother's estate, my maternal grandmother, Gran's own late sister, had included a piece of property in Gray County that had been sold 5 years ago in a transaction that Gran had never been able to get a clear accounting of. My mother had been the executor. I felt the room tilt slightly the way it had in the weeks after the accident when I sat up too fast and the blood pressure cuff alarmed. Not a physical sensation this time. Something else. Gran reached over and took my hand. I know this is a great deal, she said. I know this is not the moment. It is the moment, I said. It's exactly the moment. I have nothing but time in here. She smiled at that. It was the same smile she had given me at 6 years old when I beat her at Scrabble for the first time, and she told me I wasn't supposed to be able to do that yet. Over the next 2 weeks, Gran came every other day. She stayed with a friend of hers in Etobicoke, a woman she had known since teacher's college, and she drove to Sunnybrook on alternating mornings with her manila folders and her butter tarts and her steadiness. We worked through what she had gathered. I added what I knew, the account statements I had photographed on my phone before the accident, the transfers, the documents I had been puzzling over. The picture that emerged was not complete, it had gaps, but it had a shape. Money had been moved through the numbered company over several years. Some of it appeared to connect to Callum's consulting fees, but some of it connected to transactions involving his parents' property holdings. Developments in the Niagara region, where Callum's father had been involved in municipal planning processes in a professional capacity that made certain of those transactions legally complicated, to say the least. And threaded through all of it, like a seam you couldn't quite unsee once you'd found it, was a set of decisions made around the time of my maternal great-aunt's estate sale. My mother had been executor. Callum had been the one to recommend the real estate agent who handled the sale. I had been the one who introduced them. I had thought I was being helpful. Callum's visits to the hospital had become shorter and less frequent. When he came, he brought flowers and reasonable conversation, and a careful distance, the kind of distance that looks like consideration but is actually management. He asked about my pain levels and my physiotherapy and whether the doctors had given a discharge timeline. He did not ask about Faye with the urgency of a man whose daughter was in the NICU. He asked about her the way you ask about something you expect to resolve itself. One afternoon he arrived while Gran was there. He didn't know she would be. The look that passed across his face when he came through the door lasted less than a second. But Gran had been watching for it, and so had I, and we both saw it. He recovered immediately. He was gracious, as he always was. He chatted with Gran about the drive from Stratford and the weather and how well I was progressing. He sat for 20 minutes, and then said he had a call he couldn't push. After he left, Gran looked at me. He knows we've been talking, she said. Yes, I said. Good, she said. My brother, a year older than me, the steady one, the one who coached minor hockey and coached himself through everything with the same unhurried reliability, came to see me that weekend. He had been to the hospital before, early on, but this was different. This time Gran had called him. He sat across from me with his elbows on his knees, listening. He was quiet through most of it. When I finished, he was quiet for a while longer. Then he said, I remember that estate sale. Mom was stressed about it for months. She kept saying the agent Callum brought in had a different timeline than she expected. Something settled in my chest. Did you say anything to her? I asked. I tried, he said. She said I didn't understand real estate. We looked at each other across the hospital room. I'm going to need a lawyer, I said. I know, he said. I already asked around, I've got a name. By January I was well enough to be discharged. Faye had come home 2 weeks earlier. She had gained enough weight. Her lungs had stabilized. And the NICU nurses had walked me through everything with a patience and thoroughness that I will be grateful for the rest of my life. My brother had set up the spare room in his house in Hamilton, and that was where Faye and I went. A blue room with a crib he had assembled himself and a window that faced a backyard maple, bare in January, branches like ink lines against a white sky. I slept in that room every night with my daughter 3 feet away. and I started to feel something that had been entirely absent since November. Solid ground. I retained the lawyer my brother had found. She was thorough and she had experience in estate litigation, which turned out to be immediately relevant. We began the formal process of reviewing the Gray County property transaction and requesting documentation from the period of my great-aunt's estate settlement. We also engaged a forensic accountant to review the numbered company and its connection to the broader set of transactions Gran had traced. Callum and I barely spoke. He had moved into the Oakville house, or rather he had remained there while I was in Hamilton, which amounted to the same thing. He sent texts about logistics, about the mortgage, about a mediator he thought we should both see. The texts were reasonable and courteous. I answered them in kind. In February, Callum's father reached out. He asked for a meeting, framed as a chance to clear the air before things went further. He said he had my best interests at heart. He said he was worried about Faye. I brought the lawyer. He had not expected that. The meeting was brief. The shift that followed happened slowly, and then all at once, which is the way these things seem to go. Regulatory filings went in. A complaint was submitted to the professional association relevant to Callum's father's former position. The forensic accountant produced a report that was specific enough, and well documented enough, that it stopped being something people could dismiss. My mother found out about the estate documentation through the lawyer. She called me, a long call, late at night, her voice going through several registers I had never heard from her. She was defensive and then frightened and then eventually quiet in a way that sounded like grief. She said she hadn't understood what she was signing. She said she had trusted the agent. She said Callum had told her it was the standard process. I believed some of it. I believed she had not understood the full scope of what had happened. I also believed she had chosen not to ask the questions that might have led to understanding, because some part of her had known that the answers would be costly. We did not fix everything in that phone call. We didn't fix everything for a long time after it either. But we stayed on the line. Gran came for a week in March. She stayed in the Blue Room when Faye and I moved to a small rental of our own, a ground floor unit in a triplex in Dundas, with a backyard and a landlord who was unremarkable in the best possible way. She sat in the kitchen while I made dinner, and Faye dozed in the bouncer seat on the counter, and we talked about everything, and nothing the way we always had, going back to when I was 9 years old, and used to spend summers with her in Stratford. One afternoon she was sitting with Faye in the backyard, the two of them in the thin March sunlight, Gran talking to my daughter in the unhurried way she had, as though Faye could follow along perfectly well, which perhaps she could. I stood in the doorway watching them, and something that had been clenched inside me for months let go. She looked up and saw me watching. "You're going to be all right," she said. Not as reassurance, as a statement of fact, delivered with the same certainty she would use for any other thing she knew to be true. I nodded. I believed her. The months that followed were not simple. Legal processes rarely are, and this one had enough threads to keep multiple professionals occupied through the spring and into the summer. There were hearings and filings and long stretches of waiting broken up by sudden urgent requests for documents. I went back to work part-time in June. Accounting work I could do remotely, because I needed both the income and the structure, the sense of moving through a day with purpose. Callum and I reached an agreement through mediation in the spring. It was not what I had once imagined my marriage becoming, and I allowed myself to grieve that fully, which took longer than I expected and was necessary anyway. Faye would be provided for. The Oakville house was listed in April. The numbered company, under scrutiny, was dissolved. Callum's father resigned from his professional board in June. The circumstances were described publicly as a personal decision. People who knew anything about the situation understood what that meant. My mother and I talked more often. We were careful with each other in a way we hadn't needed to be before, which was strange and sometimes exhausting, and also somehow more honest than we had been in years. She asked about Faye constantly. I sent her photographs every few days. She drove to Dundas twice before summer, sitting in my small kitchen and holding her granddaughter with an attention and a tenderness that I found I could not entirely separate from grief or from gratitude, so I stopped trying to separate them. Gran's health had been declining since early spring quietly, the way things decline in people who have learned to carry difficulty without making it visible. I visited Stratford when I could. Sometimes she was sharp and full of opinions about everything and amused by the ducks in the Avon River. Sometimes she was tired in a way that went past the body. I was with her in September when she had a bad week. I stayed 4 nights, sleeping on the daybed in her spare room with Faye, in a travel crib beside me, listening to the particular sound a small-town Ontario night makes. The trains in the distance. The quiet that is different from city quiet. We sat together on the last afternoon before I drove back to Dundas. The light was the particular September light that I have always loved, low and golden and unhurried. She was looking out the window at the garden she had kept for 50 years, the asters still blooming, late season purple against the fence. She told me she was proud of me. Not for the legal outcomes, not for the documents or the accountant or the hearings. For the fact that I had not become someone I wasn't. For the fact that I had stayed angry without becoming hardened, and that I had stayed soft without becoming passive, and that I had kept Faye at the center of every decision without using her as a reason to avoid the hard ones. I held her hand and I didn't say much. She passed away in October, early in the month, on a morning when the maple in my backyard was at the full height of its color. My brother called me. I stood in the kitchen with Faye on my hip and looked out the back window at the tree, and I cried long enough that Faye got confused and patted my face, which made me cry a little more, and then made me laugh. I had known it was coming. It had still taken something irreplaceable with it. I planted a garden in the backyard the following spring. Nothing complicated. Some perennials, a few shrubs, the kind of thing that comes back on its own without being managed. On warm mornings, I bring Faye outside and she walks the perimeter the way toddlers do, touching everything, narrating something I can't quite interpret, deeply serious about all of it. I think about Gran often in those moments. I think about what she carried quietly for years, what she waited patiently to tell me, what she drove 3 hours through a December day to bring to my hospital room, because she had decided that the right moment was now, and not some more convenient later. I think about the fact that the person who told me the truth was not the person I was married to, or the person who raised me. It was an old woman with a manila folder and a tin of butter tarts who saw something the rest of them had chosen not to see, and who decided that silence had cost enough already. The hard part of this story is not the accident, or the legal proceedings, or even the end of the marriage. The hard part is the understanding that people you love can look away from things that matter. Not always out of malice. Sometimes out of fear, or convenience, or the desire to believe that whatever is wrong will sort itself out eventually. It doesn't always sort itself out. Sometimes you have to be the one who sorts it out, even when you're doing it from a hospital bed with 2 fractured ribs and a daughter in the NICU down the hall. Faye is 2.5 now. She has her own opinions about everything, expressed at considerable volume and with tremendous conviction. She calls my grandmother's photograph, the nice lady, when I show it to her, which feels right. We have a life that is ordinary in the best way, the full, textured genuinely ours way. No hidden agendas, no careful management, no smiles that don't mean anything. Just the backyard and the garden, and the maple turning gold every October. And my daughter running through the fallen leaves with the absolute certainty of someone who has never had any reason to doubt that the ground is solid beneath her feet. I want to keep it that way. What would you have done in my place? Tell me in the comments. I read every single one. And if this story stayed with you, please subscribe to Family Shadows. There's more to come.